Levi Hutton rode up to the gate of the Broken Wheel Ranch on a grey morning in October 1883, 20 minutes past the hour the auction notice had promised, and he already knew, from the empty road and the dust still settling over fresh wagon tracks, exactly what that meant. He swung down anyway, boots hitting frozen mud, and walked to the gate the way a man walks toward bad news he already suspects he's earned. A woman stood on the other side of it with a shotgun broken open over one arm, not aimed, just present, the way a rancher carries a tool she might need and hopes she won't. She had dark hair escaping a braid gone loose from a long night's work, a canvas coat buttoned wrong in the cold, and eyes that had clearly stopped expecting good news from strangers on horseback sometime around dawn. "You arrived too late," she said. 4 words, flat and final, delivered the way you'd read a brand off a hide, no anger in them, just fact. Levi Hutton stood there at the gate of a ranch he had never once set foot on, holding the reins of a horse that had run 12 hard miles for nothing, and something in his chest went cold and then, strangely, did not stay cold. He reached out and lifted the gate latch anyway. And here is the part that stopped Sadie Vance's hand halfway back to the shotgun stock, though she'd have denied it stopped her at all. He did not argue with her. He did not demand to be let past. He simply opened the gate the way a man opens a door he intends to walk through regardless of what's said on the other side of it, and stepped onto her land like the word "too late" was a fact he intended to argue with the world instead of with her. "I expect you're right," he said. "I still mean to come in if you'll allow it." A man ought to at least see the damage he was too slow to prevent. I have gone through a fair number of territorial newspapers from that stretch of Colorado, and I can tell you plainly that most men, arriving late to an auction that had already stripped a woman of her herd, would have turned that horse around and ridden home, nursing their own bad luck. Levi Hutton did not turn around. To understand why, you have to know 2 things at once: what he already knew standing at that gate, and what he did not yet know about the woman holding the shotgun. Stay for both. They matter equally. 3 days before that morning, Sadie Vance had been doing the only thing she knew how to do with a debt that size, which was working herself past sense trying to outrun it. She was 24, had run the Broken Wheel alone since her father's heart gave out the winter before, and had spent every one of those months learning that grief and a mortgage note do not wait politely for each other. The bank in Cedar Forks held paper on the ranch that her father had signed the year before he died, confident in a spring that never came good, and by the time Sadie understood the size of what she'd inherited, the note was already 6 months overdue and climbing interest like a fever. The bank's agent, a soft-spoken man named Silas Crane, who wore town shoes on ranch land and never once got them dirty, had explained the arrangement to her with the patient, regretful tone of a man delivering news he'd arranged himself. The Broken Wheel would go to auction, not the land, not yet. Just the breeding herd, 22 head of the finest stock her father had spent a decade building, and the proceeds would go against the note. If the auction raised enough, she'd keep the land clear a while longer. If it didn't, Crane's bank held the right to call the balance in full, and everyone standing in that office knew exactly what happened to ranches that couldn't answer a call like that. What Sadie did not know, because Crane had taken some care that she shouldn't, was that he'd quietly discouraged two of the three ranchers likely to bid competitively and moved the auction's posted time up by 2 hours from what the notice in the Cedar Forks paper actually said. Banking correctly, that word of the change would travel slow to a woman with no time to check newspapers twice. Levi Hutton was the third rancher. He ran cattle on the Anvil Creek spread 18 miles east, had never met Sadie Vance in his life, but had heard enough from a lawyer friend in Cedar Forks who'd caught wind of Crane's arrangement and didn't care for the smell of it, to saddle up before sunrise, meaning to outbid whatever the bank had rigged the room to accept. He'd ridden hard. He'd still ridden into an empty yard, a scattering of departing wagon dust, and a woman who'd just watched 22 head of her father's life's work walk off behind 3 separate buyers for less than half what they were worth, at an hour 2 full hours before the one she'd planned around. "There's coffee," Sadie said, once the gate had swung shut behind him and the shotgun had gone back to hanging unspoken at her side. "It's bad coffee. I haven't had the mind for good coffee since sunup." They sat on her porch steps, because the house behind her felt, she said later, too much like a place a stranger shouldn't be invited into, on the worst morning she'd had in a year. She told him the whole of it, the note, the 2 hours Crane had moved without troubling to say so, the herd gone now to men who'd paid a price that wouldn't clear a third of what she owed. "He moved the time," Levi said, working it over slowly, "so the room would be thin enough that nobody paid what those cattle were worth, so the auction would raise just enough to look honest and just little enough to leave you still owing him plenty." "That's about the shape of it," Sadie said. "I can't prove the 2 hours. It's my word against a posted notice he'll swear was never touched." "I can prove the 2 hours," Levi said. "My lawyer friend in Cedar Forks watched Crane change that posting himself 3 days back, and mentioned it to me exactly because he didn't like watching it happen and had no standing to stop it. That's worth something in front of a judge, if it comes to that." Sadie looked at him then, properly, the way you look at a fact that's landed sideways from where you expected trouble to come from. Why would you ride 18 miles to bid against a stranger's banknote? Because a rigged auction 2 hours off its posted time isn't a fair fight, and I don't much care for watching those, whoever's losing them, Levi said. And because I got here too late to fix it the honest way, with money on the table, so it seems the decent thing now is to see if there's a less honest, a less simple, way to fix it instead. It was, Sadie thought, an odd kind of comfort, delivered over coffee, bad enough to strip paint, from a man she'd known less than an hour. But comfort it was, the plain, unglamorous kind that comes from someone taking your problem seriously enough to have already started working it in his head before he'd finished saying hello. "The note comes due complete in 30 days, she said. "Crane's Bank can call it whole if I miss a payment, and without the breeding herd, I've got nothing left worth grazing that could earn it back in time. 22 head was the whole plan." "Then we need a different plan," Levi said, "and 30 days to build it in. I've got stock of my own I can spare toward restocking your herd on shares, if you're willing to run them here and split what they throw off. It isn't charity. It's a bad bargain dressed up reasonable, same as most good ones are at the start." Sadie sat with that a long moment, turning it over the way she'd have turned over a horse before buying, checking the legs and the wind and the temperament all at once. You're offering to hand half your herd to a woman you met over bad coffee this morning. I'm offering to lend it, Levi said. What gets settled between us on paper or otherwise is a conversation for later, and only if you're willing to have it. I've watched Silas Crane strip 2 other outfits in this county the same slow way, and I don't intend to watch a third. Call it stubbornness if the word partnership sits wrong. She called it neither, out loud, but she shook his hand on it before the coffee had gone properly cold, and that, in its way, was answer enough. Whatever Levi Hutton expected of the days that followed, and he'd half expected a woman freshly gutted by a bad morning to need managing, careful handling, the reality surprised him considerably. Sadie Vance worked from first light to last with a competence that made his loaned stock feel less like charity and more like an investment any sensible man would have made regardless of the coffee or the company. She knew every acre of that range better than he knew his own, doctored a sick calf on the second night, with a steadiness that told him everything about the years she'd spent doing exactly this alongside a father who trusted her with it early. By the end of the first week, his own 2 hands, sent over to help settle the new stock, had stopped asking him twice a day whether the arrangement was wise and started asking Sadie instead which pasture she wanted worked next. Levi watched all of it, with an expression his own foreman caught more than once, and couldn't quite name. Not surprise exactly, something closer to a bell ringing a note he half remembered from somewhere he couldn't place. The 30 days had a way of not feeling like a countdown so much as a shape they were building together. Evenings spent at Sadie's kitchen table with Crane's paperwork spread between them, working out which of his loans, which of her land, which combination of both might satisfy the note without leaving either of them holding all the risk alone. It was, on more evenings than either of them said aloud, the kind of conversation that stops being about surviving a debt and starts, without much ceremony, being about something else entirely. Silas Crane rode out on the 11th day to see for himself what had gone wrong with an arrangement he'd been so careful to rig clean, and did not trouble to hide his displeasure at finding Anvil Creek cattle grazing broken-wheel grass under a competent woman's management instead of an empty, foreclosed range waiting on his bank's convenience. "Word in Cedar Forks is Hutton's lending you stock," Crane said, not dismounting, looking the new herd over with the particular contempt of a man watching a plan come apart in front of him. "That note's still going to come due whole in 19 days, Miss Vance, borrowed cattle or not, and I'll be telling the bank's directors exactly how convenient it is that a neighbour rode to your rescue the same week his lawyer friend started asking questions about my auction posting." "Ask your questions plainly instead of riding them out here sideways, Mr. Crane," Sadie said, before Levi could answer, in a voice that had settled 22 nervous head onto a stock trail without once needing to raise itself. "I've got a witness who watched you move that posting 2 hours off what the paper printed, and a lawyer in town who's already written it down proper. You go ahead and tell your directors that. I expect they'll have their own opinions on which one of us understands what an honest auction looks like." Crane had no immediate answer to that, and rode off considerably less certain of his tidy arithmetic than he'd arrived. Levi watched her a long moment after the dust settled. "You didn't need me standing here for that." "Didn't need you," Sadie agreed. "Wanted you here for it anyway, which I find is turning into a habit I'm not in any hurry to break." It was the closest either of them had come to saying the plain truth of it out loud, and neither one made a show of the moment, though both noticed it land. A letter reached Sadie on the 14th day, forwarded up from the Cedar Forks post office, and it was not the kind of letter that made anything simpler. It was from her mother's sister in Denver, mentioning in the same unhurried hand she used for weather and gossip alike, that a respectable cattle buyer named Thomas Reed had been asking after Sadie for the better part of a year, and that a man who kept asking after a oneer a year running without a single discouraging word to slow him down was a man worth a proper answer, whichever direction that answer ran. Sadie read it twice on the porch steps, and a third time after supper, and Levi, coming by to check the new stock in the last of the light, saw her face and had the good sense not to ask straight out. She wrote back that night by lamplight, and what she found herself writing after 2 torn drafts was the plain truth, that she'd met a man over bad coffee and worse news, and that the arrangement between them had stopped feeling like borrowed cattle and a shared debt somewhere around the 11th day, and started feeling like something she wasn't in any hurry to explain away to a suitor in Denver she'd never once pictured a life beside. She didn't yet know what to call what she and Levi Hutton had built in 2 short weeks. She only knew it wasn't nothing, and that the not knowing for the first time in a long, grieving year didn't frighten her the way not knowing usually did. 9 days before the note came due, mending a torn cinch strap by lamplight on her porch, Sadie caught herself humming a tune under her breath, an old wandering thing with no words she could remember, just a shape of notes that had lived in the back of her chest for 3 years, without a name attached. Levi, sitting across from her sorting bank papers, went very still. "Where'd you learn that tune?" he asked, in a voice that had changed entirely. Sadie looked up, surprised. "I don't rightly know. I've hummed it since a wildfire 3 years back, out past the Anvil range line when I was running cattle alone all night, trying to keep them ahead of the smoke. There was a rider out there with me, never got his name, never saw his face clear through all that smoke and dark, but he had a harmonica in his coat pocket, and played this same tune low and steady the whole night, to keep the herd from bolting blind. Left before the smoke cleared enough to see him proper. I've hummed it without thinking about it ever since." Levi reached slowly into his coat and drew out an old tin harmonica, dented at one corner, and set it on the table between them, without a word. Sadie's hands went still on the cinch strap. "That fire took my whole west pasture that year," she said, quiet now, the whole shape of her attention shifting. "I'd have lost the herd entire if that rider hadn't kept them calm till dawn. I lost my own bearings that same night, chasing smoke instead of scents," Levi said. "Found a herd already being run steady by somebody who plainly knew the ground better than I did, and played along beside her the rest of the night because it seemed the only useful thing a lost man could do. I never got a name either. Just a voice in the dark, telling the cattle it'd be all right, same as she told me 2 weeks back on a porch over coffee on the worst morning of her year." He almost laughed, and it came out closer to something else entirely. "Sadie Vance, I don't believe you've ever once arrived anywhere too late in your life." The note came due on the 23rd, and between Levi's shares, the lawyer's sworn account of Crane's altered posting, and a Cedar Forks banker considerably less eager to defend his agent once the altered notice came to light, the Broken Wheel's debt was settled clean, with the bank's own board quietly relieving Silas Crane of his position before the month was out. They married that same season in the yard at the Broken Wheel, the old tin harmonica in Levi's coat pocket through the whole ceremony, and Sadie, in her father's mended riding coat instead of anything borrowed or bought new, because a woman doesn't stop being who saved a man in a wildfire just because the rest of the story finally caught up to that night. If this one found you at the right hour, there's more waiting, complete from first gate to last, right here. Come sit a while. The coffee's better than it was that first morning, and the fire's not going anywhere.